Well, thank you for that extraordinary honour. I'm a little bit confused sometimes about the past because you'll realise that I've been recycled. I think I'm the only Lord Mayor that served in 2 centuries. And having said that, I wasn't the Lord Mayor 100 years ago when this group got together. But there was a Lord Mayor in the room. Benithan was here at that time, and I understand that most Lord Mayors have been involved with this club, which meets regularly, has survived and thrived and contributed much to our community. I've been asked already today how I found being Lord Mayor for a second time. And I think the first thing to say is that everything changes and some things stay the same. So the office is completely identical, actually. That hasn't changed. But the types of people on council have changed, and the staff have changed, and the organisation has changed. But the most important thing is the city is still the capital city and is still important. And I have to say I've never had any ambition to be a Lord Mayor or a Member of Parliament or anything. My only requirement about any challenge that I've taken up is that I think I should make a difference. And usually before I nominate, I have a moment of soul searching where I pull my hair out and think, gosh, it's awful, this needs sorting out. And that's what I did at midnight on the 3rd of September when I was in a B&B in Margate. I'd just been to my son's wedding in London, and I had read online, and that's the best way to read the Advertiser, online and quickly. And I read online that the council had struggled to close a road, and the Premier had intervened to close a road, and I was incandescent with rage because I thought that's below his pay grade. If the local government can't close a road, there is a real problem. And in a fit of anger at 5 minutes to midnight, on my second glass of red wine, I nominated. And it took me a while to get back to Australia, by which time everyone was campaigning. But the good thing, the marvellous thing about the Australian electoral system is that you can win on preferences. And since all the other candidates hated each other, they all gave me their preferences, so I snuck across the line. So what am I doing now I'm there? Well, the first trick is to make sure we stay off the front page of the paper as much as possible, because we want to be civilised and well-behaved and act appropriately. But it's, I think, interesting to come back after a long time, and actually I think it's 22 years between my exploits at the town hall, so a lot has changed. And the first thing I discovered was that the council was very generous. It loved being nice to people, so they decided to abolish the rental system for outdoor dining, and they had decided to abolish the fees for parklands events, and they had decided to freeze the rates, and they had decided not to reassess the valuations of property. And the thing that did to me was to realise that I left when the budget was $120 million a year, and I came back and it was $230 million a year. And just think of 22 years gap. Is there anything in your life that's only doubled in value? I suspect your property has gone up 5-fold. And that told me that there was a problem with our finances. And that, to a large extent, explained why the footpaths were broken, the gutters were poorly maintained, the roads were run down, and there weren't many streetscapes being improved. And so the first thing I did was something that makes me terribly unpopular. We're going to put the rates up. We're going to reimpose fees for cafes. that have outdoor dining, and I'm talking about fees, but for 10 square metres, I'm talking about $11 a week. It's hardly, going to drive people to the wall, and impose fees for big functions in the parklands that, after all, charge entry as well. So that was about getting money through the door so that we could do good things. And I'm quite old-fashioned. I think councils are there to do the roads, the rates, the rubbish properly, and to make sure the streets look good, and then you can be imaginative, you can be audacious, you can be bold, you can be really out there doing exciting things, but you have to get the core business right. And the other thing I'm quite aware of is that there are significant issues. Of course, it's a bad time to put the rates up, but when they've been frozen for 10 years and you put them up 8%, that's hardly, beyond the realms of possibility, even though it is after COVID. So that there are big problems in our city, much as I love it, and there is a lot that's improved while I've been away. It is marvellous that people are aware now that the environment matters and we should plant more trees to keep the temperatures down. It is fabulous that one minister allowed little bars in laneways so young people can have fun. It's amazing that the state government has poured money into the city for major events, and there are things happening all the year round. But there are pluses and minuses about everything. And the pluses and minuses about big events is that they're always in the same place, and so there are always winners and losers. So if you always have things in the East End and nobody can drive from Burnside into the central market, then you damage the central market's trade while the eastern parklands are blocked off. And the restaurants on the western side of the city suffer because nobody can get in. So there are winners and losers, and one of the things that we need to do is spread the joy around and spread the pain and the gain of major events. So it's a blessing and a curse. The curse is, of course, that we've been trying to upgrade the Rymel Pond for 7 years. And we have had multiple investigations and consultations and designs, and it keeps being cancelled. Why? Because there are so many events there. So it's taken a lot of courage to say, I'm sorry, you've got to move away from the pond. And the reason it had to be done is we're spending $160,000 a year topping up the pond because it leaks, like a giant swimming pool, $160,000 a year on water. And so we've come up with a scheme to get a creek to go through a reed bed and replenish the water, and if it's maintenance, it might cost $10,000 to $20,000 a year. So we have to do it, but everybody's cross, and because it means that we've got to pull back the fringe, but we have a deadline. There's a blowtorch out there and a promise. Someone's promised in blood that it will be finished by the horse trials in April. And I suspect I've signed in blood, so there are going to be horses on my doorstep if it's not ready. So that planning is really difficult when you have a lot of major events. And also the government, because they don't trust the council, has intervened to the extent that they say, oh yes, you can come in, harvest rock, you can do this, and they all give them the same bit of land, so that again we extrapolate the winners and losers to occur more often. But the 4 things I noticed before the election are the things I'm really absolutely obsessed by, the 4 major problems in the city. And the first thing to do is to recognise we have a problem. We have a problem with housing. Everybody knows we've got a housing crisis. We have a huge problem with retail. And although COVID has treated Adelaide better than the East Coast, we still have 20% of our office space vacant because people don't want to work. No, they don't want to work. They don't want to work in the office. And interestingly, we've done surveys, and there are certain cohorts of people who don't ever want to go back to the office. And some people, and I find this a little hard to take because maybe I'm too old, but there are groups of people who say they'll only go back to work if they're paid more to compensate them for travelling in and out. I find that difficult to take because I think which part of going to work don't you get? But, that is difficult. But it does mean that there are employers, and 70 to 80% of employers say they do not expect their staff to come back always. And most places are back 3 days a week. But that office vacancy feeds on, and flows on, I should say, to retail. You clearly don't need 10 coffee shops to service an office block if nobody's at work. So the retail is really struggling, and even Rundle Mall has around 20% vacancies in that precinct. And that's our premier location where we market like there's no tomorrow to get people in there. We have events, we have lights, we have activities, we have giveaways. But retail is really struggling in the city. And if you walk away from Rundle Street and you get down to Gouger Street and you get down to Gilbert Street and you look in the side streets, you can have areas with only 50% occupancy. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for those who were employed, it's a tragedy for the property owners, it's a tragedy for the retail or the cafe owner, many of whom are mums and dads investors who've lost a lot. They've lost their investment and they've got an empty premise. So really, the housing shortage is also linked to the employment, because if the retail's struggling and you've got insufficient people living in the city, then again it all feeds into a spiral. So the housing's really interesting. Because I've been around a long time, I remember when there were 17,000 people living in the city. Some of you who are a little bit older than me might remember the 50s when there were 50,000 people in the city. And what's happened is that there's a demographic shift, so that when I left the council, there were 2.7 people in each dwelling. Now there are 1.7 people in each dwelling. And in the old days, in the 50s, there were 6.4 people. So what it means is that the houses have changed. People don't marry, they live alone, they are divorced, and that means that we've built 9,000 dwellings in the last 10 years, and you've barely got 12,000 people living in them. And so we have to build more to get less people. So I left with 17,000. I've come back and there are 25,000, despite a massive building boom. And this is madness, because we're running constantly to stand still. And the reason we want to increase the population is, and I know this sounds like growth is good and we can only survive by growth, but if people are not coming to work, the only option is to make them live in the city, so they're working from home and they're going to the cafe downstairs. And the only option to keep the shops open is to have the retail servicing the residents. So we need more residents in the city. Plus, there is a massive housing shortage and a massive crisis of residency pricing. And that's why the council is obsessed with actually looking at property and trying to do some developments ourselves that we can push through the community housing sector so that we can house people at below market rates. Because one of the advantages of poorer people is that the richer you are, the less often you're at home, and the less money you spend, because you're on a cruise, you're overseas, you're at your house by the beach. We want more people with less money who stay at home and spend it all, which sounds crude, but people who are at home all the time are what we need to keep the shops going. And the other issue about having people living in the city is that it makes it safer for everybody. So the fact that we've still got half the population of 1950 is a sign that things are not working. So the housing's a problem, the retail's a problem, and the offices are a problem. And the fourth area of risk is the skills shortage. If you run a cafe in Adelaide, you're probably struggling. And have you noticed how few open on Monday? Have you noticed how few are open for breakfast? That's not because they're lazy, it's because they can't fill their rosters. And you can't fill your roster if the closest you can afford to live to the city is Salisbury North. Who wants to work for a late restaurant shift and have to travel on a train to Salisbury North? I've got nothing against Salisbury North, but it's a long way away in the middle of the night. So we want more staff in the city and the people in the city able to work. So all those things are problems, but they're also opportunities for a solution. So if you think about it, if the shops are struggling and the buildings are empty, why not have people live above the shops? If there are low-scale offices that are empty, why not convert some of them to accommodation? And it's not rocket science, it's happened all over the world. But we have a huge number of retail premises, you know, Gouger Street, Hutt Street, Grenfell Street, that many with empty shops below, but they have small-scale office space above that can be converted. So it won't solve the housing crisis, but if we can convert maybe 100 a year to residential, it will help us staff the city and it will impact on low-income people who will be able to afford. Because frankly, if you're really rich, you won't want to stay over a shop in Hindley Street. Am I getting the hurry up? Sorry. So it's not for everybody, but it's clearly for somebody. And when we've actually sorted out some of these issues, and we've got funding from the state government to help us with the housing in the city, we can also look at ways to make it financially viable, because I know there are builders in this room who will tell me that there are fire regulations, there are disability regulations, there are all sorts of reasons you can't do this. But if you work with the regulatory bodies, you can find ways around disability. If it's an old building that's heritage listed, we can shovel some of our heritage funding at it. If we need double glazing, we can put some of our sustainability money. So we can actually cobble together incentives across the whole of state, council and state government to make it viable. And we've got a staff member whose only job will be to triage and help people. And what I'm trying to do with all these policies, and I've got another one which is greening and refurbishing laneways so people can grow veggies in them and you can plant trees. We're looking at ways to increase our tree cover, because one of the things we have to do, which is maybe a bit more audacious than just dealing with housing, is dealing with climate adaptation. You and I, most of the people in this room, won't be alive in 50 years' time, but our grandchildren will be. And I lay in bed at night thinking, what will my children think of me if we haven't invested in doing things that make a difference? They will say, you were in council, you were in government, you were in council again. Well, actually, when I was in government, we put through climate change legislation, and that's why we have the most renewables in the country. So we did do something useful. But now we still have an opportunity to really do something significant, because whatever we do, it doesn't matter how much we buy EV cars, it doesn't matter how much we try to offset our energy usage. The temperatures are rising, and by the time my children are 40, there'll be 45 degrees and 50 degrees days in the city. And so we have to do something dramatically different. And there are technological things we should be doing, whether it's green roofs, whether it's canopy cover, whether it's investing in asphalt that can lower the temperature of the street above. We have to start incrementally doing that now, because otherwise Adelaide is uninhabitable for our children. If it's 50 degrees, well, I can walk around at 38 degrees. I'm slower at 40. And I'm not going to walk to the market when it's 43. So we have to find a way of making our city tolerable for those 45 to 50 degree days. If we don't invest now, there's no future for this city. And that involves water, shade, greenery, and sophisticated, clever infrastructure that will make a difference. So back to roads, rates and rubbish. You have to get those things right, but if you do, then you can start dabbling in other areas and making the city viable for the future. Thank you.
The Lord Mayor is okay to take a couple of questions, just 2 questions.
I'm a bit worried about no lunch down there.
No, it's coming back hot for you. It's coming back hot for you. Milo, yeah? Yes.
Lord Mayor, thank you for your address.
So you're responsible You are. Frank doesn't believe he's responsible. I think he brought me to Australia, but he doesn't believe that.
We both came to Australia, Lord Mayor. I'm excited by your vision, and thank you for the call to action. Two things. Hopefully international students will fill some of the vacuum that's in the city. But secondly, in another life, I was chair of a community housing organisation, and I'm sure they would be willing to engage with the City Hall in developing and rehabilitating the spaces that are now vacant. So do you have an officer that actually is responsible for this?
Well, we're just interviewing because we've got the funding from the state government, jointly funded, and they should start in 2 weeks' time. But we'll contact you, Frank, and we think it's likely that if you get a decent-sized developer, they can understand you've got to spend money to earn money, but some of the mums and dads will struggle. Some of them won't want to be involved with residents because they're more trouble than a commercial tenant. And so we think it might be necessary to batch together a few of these properties and get a community housing provider to do a head lease and then rent it out. So.
Lord Mayor, thank you very much for your leadership and for your vision and the discussion about the future of Adelaide, the parklands. And thank you for your support of the parklands themselves. I have a general question though. Why, when the state government is thinking about taking the parkland, is there not an environmental, a social and economic cost that's allocated to the parkland? Why are they always considered as free space for trading off to somewhere else? Thank you.
Well, you can imagine that I've had some very testy conversations with the Premier and the Commissioner for Police, and it's been very interesting, let's say. Particularly the argument from the police that a horse can't cross the road. And I've explained that the horses can cross the road the way old ladies do at the traffic lights. And they could be anywhere, but not in the parklands. And actually, just to be clear, people love horses, but the design for this facility was about 4.5 hectares of buildings, even before you got the horses. So there was a lot of building, not just horses in a fenced area. I have never understood why people think the parklands are disposable and free. It's not fringe lunatic green is saying this. Normal people are saying this is an asset for the future. And you have to argue about everything. Now, it might sound weird that I think the swimming pool's inevitable. The swimming pool's there now, and we're going to replace the swimming pool. The reality is that once you've got a building, it's impossible to get rid of it. So you have to have the fight to stop the building, but to actually think we're going to remove a hospital is mad, because what will happen is what's happened now. They empty and vacate a hospital in one place, and then they sell the land to someone. And then they move up the North Terrace, build another one, and then 50 years later, when it's derelict, they'll move on and sell it to someone. It's quite clear to me that the current Women's and Children's Hospital will be sold for housing, not reinstated as parklands. And it's quite clear that North Terrace has gone completely. So basically there has to be a fight over everything. And I'm amazed there was no fight over the Walker buildings, which again are on parklands and are so close to the state parliament. It's an abusive, thuggish, unnecessary building. Free land. I'm mystified why everybody isn't up in arms. I'm just relieved there was everyone joined in the campaign against the horse barracks. But one of the things that happens in government is you make one injudicious decision and it's like a domino effect. So you need to get the dogs, you need to send the horses, you need the terrorism gang, you need the road safety, and then it's just madness. And I actually feel really strongly that if this hospital is going to cost 3.2 million today, it'll be 5 to 10 million by the time it's built. and therefore the whole of Port Road would have been $100 million purchased, and it will be a rounding error. A rounding error. It's an immaterial amount of money. But I can't explain why people don't see that.